Hello there. In the famous passage, which is the beginning of the whole Christmas cycle, we have this wondrous encounter between heaven and earth when the Archangel Gabriel appears to Zechariah precisely in a liturgical context. And the people are outside. They're not playing guitars, at least most of the time. They're actually in prayer mode and not even speaking, but they are participating internally, and far more than many a good guitarist. And he is there in more of the same. In fact, it's quite interesting how there's a strong parallel between what goes on there and what goes on to this day in the Eastern Rite, when at certain moments the priest is alone with his God, and invisibly so. So we have here, in the first chapter of St. Luke, this way in which he was in a context which was favourable, and God zoomed in. Now, while he was serving as a priest before God, when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, it fell to him by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at the hour of incense. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord, standing on the right side of the altar of incense. Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer is heard." Our prayer is heard when it is intense and sincere, but we need to be careful not to be in automatic mode. It's too simple just to be in that automatic pilot system where we expect it all to happen even if we're miles away. We must engage, as did Zechariah, so that our prayer may be truly heard. As with human beings, we know when somebody is listening to us, when somebody is present to us. The signs are clear. How much twiggling and figgling goes on, e.g. to some interesting screen, even in our presence. More of the same can happen with our God if we're not careful. Today, I would like to proceed with the development of the liturgical movement, and I would like to indicate to begin with how they were fairly keen on making things happen concretely, even at an early stage. They began to promote the dialogue Mass, where actually not just the two servers say certain bits, but the whole people do as well. This was a preliminary stage towards what we now have when all the responses belong to all and only to them. That is to say that they don't have this element of some representing them before the altar, which was the concept of the altar boys before. So they also promoted the people's editions of the Missal. This was an important step because from that point onwards people were, if they were devout, carrying with them the prayer of the Church at Mass itself, and not just devotions which could be said during the prayer of the Church. It was the actual voice of the Church being carried in their books, and they could engage with what was going on from moment to moment. The only thing was that the old books were still there, the treasuries, where actually other modes of assisting were hinted at. One would have been the way in which the various sections of the Mass itself were divided into moments of the Passion. So it was still the element of praying devotional prayers are not actually the prayers of the Mass itself. This element of the missal was a different one. Other liturgical books too being published, and indeed liturgical periodicals, and these of course would have a seminal effect of diffusing ideas amongst intellectuals, preparing the way eventually for Sacrosanctum Concilium. It held sessions, it held liturgical weeks, and actually even established schools of sacred music, of liturgical music. That is to say, it was all in view of genuine participation also with the beauty of the voice. And eventually institutes of academic liturgical study. Of course, the huge foundation in Rome on the Aventine, St. Anselmo, important to this day in liturgical study, was a milestone. It's a very difficult license, that one, and quite a few don't get there because it's so demanding. They abandon ship halfway through, but it's a very, very good course. One learns many things in the course of that high-powered formation in liturgical study. So, let's see what they were focusing on. Some names come through. One would be Joseph Goetler. He was a university professor at Munich. In the war years, First War, he was a chaplain to the German forces. But in 1916 he managed to deliver an important paper, Pia Desideria Liturgica, pious liturgical desires. Well, desideria, it's not exactly desires, but things that could be opted for, could be wished for. He called for the abolition of accretions. Now, these would be popular German practices, not strictly part of the liturgical rite. And also for an end to unnecessary duplication. Readings read once in Latin and then in the vernacular, for instance. He argued for the possibility of the vernacular in the first part of the rite of Mass itself, and goes as far as asking, would it really be un-Catholic to say the fore Mass, the first part of it, only once in German? Now, this has been taken up at a later date by H.E. Winston, and he, in 1957, had this to say on this paper. It is impossible to read this paper and not to marvel at the courage, the almost prophetic insight, and the thoroughness and clarity of vision of the author. He covered every department of the liturgy, the sacramental ritual, the Mass, and the breviary. Now, these three, the rituale, that which concerns sacramentals and the like, the Mass, of course, and the breviary, these are 3 points of perpetual encounter between human souls and God in the context of church life. So all three were handled, and in detail. So in him we find an early espousal of liturgical reform, but one that is primarily motivated by a desire to remove from the liturgy those practices that smother it So he discusses minor simplifications of the rite, asking, for instance, whether Psalm 42, that's the one that in the old rite comes at the foot of the altar. Introibor altare Dei, I will go up to the altar of God. And the prayer, Munda Cor Meum, that's one of the prayers that in the old rite the priest would say before proclaiming the gospel. Actually, a vestige of that is still there in the new rite. However, he was not advocating a substantial ritual restructuring. His aim rather was to allow the liturgy the freedom to nourish piety. And that, of course, would be the thrust of the liturgical reform that we know. So these were important early signals, intuitions. We have the great Adrian Fortescue. He was rector of St. Hugh in Letchworth from 1907 to 1923, and an early pioneer in England of liturgical piety. So, most of his writings were historical, though his most famous work is his ceremonial manual, The Ceremonies of the Roman Rite Described. And it was something that many priests would have at hand for consultation. In the 1917 preface to the first edition of that manual, he mentions a desire for liturgical reform. He objects to some of the more elaborate ritual gestures, for example. See, there was this element of enormous punctuality. Things were to the degree almost on the compass indicated, and it did have the protective effect of making sure that no one did what he wanted to. But the only thing is that if it's so encumbering that it becomes the centre of the priest or the people's attention, then it's taking away from intimacy. It's true that after a while even that can become automatic, and then that gives freedom. But the need for a certain simplification was being felt, and not just by him. And of course it came through at the Second Vatican Council. He was advocating the simplification of the obligation of kissing things, because in the old rite the people represented by the servers throw an element of distance on the scene by showing that there's a great respect for anything which in any way touches God. They kiss anything being handed to the celebrant and anything being received back. The osculations, they're called. Well, he was advocating that this should be simplified. They're actually still there. And it's interesting because in the 1962 missal which we're using, the one that we're supposed to be using if we're doing the old rite, they are maintained in the rituale, that's the actual introduction to it, the general instruction. So they're officially still there. It may perhaps be admitted that some measure of simplification is desirable, he says. Now that liturgical reform is so much in the air, we may hope for reforms in this direction too. The chief note in the Roman Rite has always been its austere simplicity. That is still its essential note, compared with the florid Eastern rites. It is surely worthwhile to preserve this note externally also, to repress any Byzantine tendencies in our ceremonies. If one compares, actually even now, the Roman Rite with any Eastern Rite, one does see this. Less so before the changes than now, because the Western Rite was fairly heavy, especially in the solemn celebrations. But compared with the Eastern Rite, what comes through is there is more precision compared with, for instance, if you've got a celebration going on for hours, 3 hours, then you won't have that exact calculation of the number of blows of incense and bells and whatever it might be that you have in the West. In the East, they're swinging backwards and forwards all the time, so it's far more elastic in a sense. There's a certain different mentality there. If they say Kyrie eleison, they don't say it once but 40 times, that kind of thing. So it's a different atmosphere. It's a kind of whole cloud of praise going up, and one is just in there. And also with the people, they're not quite so mathematically inclined as we would be. They kiss and kiss and kiss the icons. They go around and make many signs of the cross, and never would they make it just one, but always 3 times. In other words, it's different mentalities. So just to give an idea, if one sees how they celebrate out there, it's just a mode. It's not the end of the world if there's one more thump of the incense more, is it? It just goes on for 3 hours. So just the mentality is different. So he sees this as something which had been damaged by the years of growth, because what happened was that out of devotion, one saw something nice happening there, and that was taken on as well. So we have different families of liturgy influencing each other, and local practices coming into other parts of the Christian world. So it became very heavy. Remember now, before the Second Vatican Council, that had been felt. Blessed John the 23rd had simplified things already. And that's why when we celebrate now in the Old Rite, we're supposed to be using the simplifications that he made in 1962. The maximum of collects that could be had until that simplification at the beginning, and therefore corresponding at other points of the celebration before, was 7. Therefore you could have 7 prayers instead of the 1 collect, which we have now. In the period up until 1962, it was normal for there to be 3 in a celebration, for instance on a Sunday. 3, therefore also at the secret, that's the offertory prayers, and also at the post-communion. It's corresponding each time. So, oremus, 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 that's heavy. That was pruned already in 1962. So it could have stayed there, and probably that would have been the intuition that actually there was no need for a huge amount of change after that, but it wasn't going to be the case. There was the intermediary 1965 missal, in which actually Psalm 42 was done away with, but other things were kept. The prayers at the foot of the altar were kept, but the psalm was done away with, as it would be at the Mass of the Dead, before even, and other things of that nature. But essentially the structure was the same, still in 1965. The canon was still in Latin and so on. 1 or 2 simplifications did happen, and the people started to come in with the Our Father entirely, that kind of thing. So there was already that halfway house. But when one uses the old rite still, one is not supposed to be using that one, 1965, or the ones earlier than 1962, but that one that was simplified by Blessed John the 23rd, but maintaining visibly the essence of the structure of the Mass of the Ages. It's a good missal, actually. So, root and branch reforms were another matter and were not actually being envisaged. Indeed, in a letter to Stanley Morrison, he would have been a typographer, Fortescue displays his own disdain for the fabrication of liturgies. Fabrication of liturgies, does that sound familiar? As well as his appreciation of the organic development of the liturgy in history. So we have this in his elegant English, very English actually in the way he writes, tongue-in-cheek almost. I think the habit of making up new liturgies could easily grow on a man, like dram drinking. It must be quite fun to spread out before one translations of all the best liturgies, and then to pick out and string together the prettiest snippets from each. Now he's referring to another author at this point, a certain William Edward Orchard. He died in 1955. Well, he was actually a Congregationalist minister at the time and president of a society of Free Catholics, so-called. But he became a Catholic in 1932 and was ordained a priest in 1935. Anyway, he's referring to this gentleman. Orchard, he says, has not the ghost of a sense of liturgical style. He understands nothing about the historic development or the inherent build of the rites he plunders. He just takes the pretty bits and strings them together anyhow. Lots of people have done this sort of thing. The Irvington liturgy, or rather the Irvingite liturgy, is another famous example. So are all the high Anglican combinations of their prayer book, with the juiciest morsels from the Roman Mass. To me, all this is silly and ugly. It is like a man with no sense of construction or style, who tries to make a new architecture by jamming together all the pretty details of all the buildings he has seen. I admire the dome of St. Peter's, and the windows of Chartres, and the propylaea at Athens, and the columns of Karnak. But I should not like to see them all jammed together. I remember hearing the provost of Pusey House in Oxford in dialogue with my friend at a break I spent with him in Oxford one weekend. He was there, and they were talking about each other as Anglicans would. My friend is by now an Anglican clergyman, like his father. Yeah, Paul, yes, Paul, yeah, Paul, yeah. The Anglican Church is a zoo in which every animal can do his own thing, as long as he doesn't get in the way of the animal in the cage next to him. In 1930, some years after Fortescue's untimely death, Henri Leclerc underlined Fortescue's contribution to the promotion of liturgical piety. In an otherwise not uncritical notice in his Dictionnaire d'archéologie chrétienne et de liturgie, Dictionary of Christian Archaeology and Liturgy. I believe Henri Leclerc was a Benedictine engaged in the liturgical movement. In fact, he didn't die all that long ago, I believe. He was at Clairvaux. It's a Benedictine house. Not spelt as Le Clairvaux where St. Bernard was. Adrian Fortescue, he says, had that originality among few others to be able to realize in his priestly, artistic, and intellectual life his ideal of the beauty of Christian worship in all its fullness, and to make liturgy a living reality. He was an important man because of the influence of his handbook, his manual, and it has been updated now to help those who are using the old rite and to know what should be happening right now. It's, in a way, more necessary because there's not that continuity that was there before. Liturgy is something not best learned from a book, but from living experience and transmission. It's a heritage. And when done so, it works perfectly well. We have found, actually, with our little altar boys, that very quickly, if one just plants them in the sanctuary, exposed to other good altar boys, and that's the bit, then by osmosis they catch things. And it's far better than having a theatrical rehearsal in the wings, because that is unsacred, whereas this is sacred from the beginning, and they get into mode immediately. And very quickly they pick up, and they know what is what by instinct, because a child is close, a child is open, and they know that they're in holy ground, and so it works. And what happens is precisely that they get the instincts naturally, very quickly, and they're good instincts. And they're very quickly then able to form others. It's good to see how it happens. Because if one has these noisy rehearsals in the sanctuary, it's a bad education, because they're talking in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. Certain things are caught, not taught. Actually, quite unexpectedly, there is an aside in one of Adrian Fortescue's writings. It's not in the main body of the text at all, but it's in an autobiographical note in something which went round, but it's not quite as well known as it ought to be. It's what he wrote one day when he was at the end of some great big work, and he put it this way. He was in his armchair admiring his cat, and he thought unto himself, "Oh, how I admire this creature. He has not to be so concerned as myself, as the number of double ductus I have to have vindicated for the thurible at this minor ceremony. He is free to play and to enjoy the air as it comes to him. Oh, were I in the ambit of my cat." And on he went with the solemn writings. So, this great Fortescue had great respect and showed actually how the things of God were to be treated. Let us not forget the centuries of education that we have grown out of in 5 years, roughly, and are not in a hurry to get back. Well, let's remember also that Zechariah was formed in liturgy, in actually centuries of liturgy. And when the Pharisees became irritated at the Lord, they were not without foundation on one point. They were afraid that he was going to be a modernist and that they were going to lose all these centuries of carefully prepared education, not of course realizing that he was there with authority, the authority of the lawgiver himself. But he did actually invite people to listen to what the Pharisees said, because, as he said, they were in the seat of Moses. What they didn't have to do was imitate what they did. But the Lord himself respected the structure, and we can be sure that he did well what an adult Jew would do. What he was reacting against was abuses and making of the house of God something else. And that same Lord would do the same if he were to come to many of our assemblies. We are, alas, not as respectful as the Pharisees themselves with regard to certain things. The only thing is that we justify ourselves as though we were the Lord himself, able to overthrow everything. Well, let's be careful. The liturgy is actually also the language of the church, and the church is the spouse of Christ. And this liturgy is not merely human. It has been given century by divine education and pedagogy. The Holy Spirit was and is leading his people, and the language of the prayer of the church is that given to it by the Holy Spirit. Therefore we can but respect the work of the Spirit both in East and in West, and with awe look at what has come down to us, which we so easily throw into the dustbin. Some years ago, while still in the monastery in Italy, I was in correspondence with a Welsh girl, actually Welsh speaking, whom I knew very well, who had been a Baptist, and also she was preaching as a Baptist. She then eventually helped the Bishop of Bangor, whom we knew well. He had also studied with us, and he used her skill, because she was a doctor in philosophy, and eventually ordained her to the Anglican priesthood, so-called. But she had a great devotion to Thérèse of Lisieux, and in the end this broke through. It's interesting what actually happened. She was on the brink and she was having doubts with regard to where the truth might be, and she asked eventually Thérèse of Lisieux to obtain for her a sign. So one day, not long after that, she happened to feel moved to ask an elderly lady whether she could help, and taking her to her local church, wherever it might be, and not realizing actually the situation, perhaps. Anyway, the point was this, that the lady took her up, and she ended up in this church which she didn't know at all. It happened to be a Catholic church, and what was the first thing she saw looking at her but Thérèse of Lisieux? So she took that as the sign, and eventually went to the Catholic bishop, actually Benedictine at the time, had been abbot of Belmont, and explained the situation. So he got her through fairly quickly what they call the real cool solution for Anglicans, because they're so well formed. Anyway, she was received, and then the first thing she did was to come over and have a retreat with us. And I was showing her one or two old things in the sacristy, which is also a chapel. That's where one celebrate quietly if one wanted to. It's an old chapel going right back to the Carolingian period, the Carolingian chapel, and underneath it was the crypt, which is very ancient. And she saw this old missal, which we were still using if we wanted to, and she saw how every gesture protected the sacred. For instance, the way in which 1 second after the words of consecration, there was straight away already a genuflection, and at that point the priest could not separate his two fingers, these two fingers here, until they were eventually washed by the second ablution. And so all this she saw well, that it was quite different from everything she was coming to, and she saw also how the Spirit had given that language to the Church, and it was a very good encounter after her reception into the Catholic Church to see the power of what she was being received into. Alas, many people now only have the encounter with what is out there on parish level, without that element of continuity with the past. And also people now being ordained have not been exposed to that continuity with the past. They've only had a certain norm, often akin actually to the worst of some Protestant mentalities, because actually the Protestants are not disrespectful. But in bending over backwards and in wanting to be as with it as one can, one very quickly becomes without it, with regard to what one actually is and should have. If it's lost in one generation, it cannot be handed on. There's a break in the chain. The education to the sacred happens. It happens from childhood. Let us ask the grace to go back, as it were with Zechariah, to the temple, and with fear and trembling, to have the people praying not noisily and with guitars, but quietly, as it were, looking on, while heaven and earth meet in a cloud of incense.
Ecce agnus Dei, ecce qui tollit peccata mundi, Domini non sum divis, ut in Christus tectum me, sit tantum diquer, et sanabitur anima me. Domini non sum divis, ut in Christus tectum me, sit tantum diquer, et sanabitur anima me. Domini non sum divis, ut in Christus tectum me, sit tantum diquer, et sanabitur anima me.